I'm Leslie Cornwell, Certified Nurse Midwife, and this next section of our course has to do with hiring employees versus independent contractors. I get this question a lot with our consulting clients, expanding their practices and starting new practices, so I wanted to make a separate conversation for people to really understand the legal and regulatory side of the different employment types. So a legal disclaimer we put at the beginning of all of our slides. Information is for general and educational purposes. Content is intended to not be substituted for professional, legal, and clinical advice. We strive to have the most timely and accurate advice as possible, but especially with accounting and legal and regulatory things, there's federal guidelines, there's state guidelines, they change. So we just want you to use this as a guidance point and then seek the legal counsel. Course objective, students will be able to verbalize the difference between an employee and an independent contractor. Students will be able to understand exactly what is an employee and what is a business contractor. Verbalize the risk involved with treating independent contractors like employees. And then the students will be able to verbalize which practice staff makes the most sense to hire for a midwifery team as an actual W-2 employee versus a 1099 contractor. Why is this important? Couple reasons. There's advantages to different types of people you hire. Do you have needs short-term, long-term? Do you want to have someone on that has skills and fills a specific need? Do you want an employee you train and you're really watching their day-to-day operations? There's specific tax and regulatory things that are different for the different type of staff you have on. Sometimes it makes sense to have an independent contractor and sometimes it makes sense to have an employee, but I really want people to understand the differences, the paperwork, the contracts, how you treat them, because it can have risk with the business. So the big difference between an employee and an independent contractor is the employer has the right to control the employee's day-to-day operations, when they're going to be there, how they're going to practice, how they're going to take care of their job, their duty, their role. They really are micromanaging their day-to-day operations within the business. An independent contractor is completely different. You only have right and control over what you've put in your scope of work agreement with them. So if your scope of contract is you have website design, you can't tell them who else they're going to work with, what days they're going to work. You have a timeline you put agreed to on your contract, your proposal, but you can't manage their day-to-day operations of how they're going to put your website together. You hire a midwife contractor, a locum. You are going to treat your locum contracted midwives differently than your employee midwives. Your employee midwives, you are responsible for their training, their orientation process, their licensure, their upkeep, their certification, their malpractice. You're going to determine which days they're going to be in the office, the exact times. An independent midwife contractor, you and that person, they're a separate entity, they're a separate business. You're going to say, I need help for 2 months, I'm going to need help for 3 months, I need backup call coverage if I'm in a bind. You're not going to be telling them, you say, I need 3 days a week full time and this is what it looks like. These are the openings that person has and they will fill in on your schedule. So you aren't training that person, they're jumping in to fill a need. Typically it's short term and it's a specific scope of work that their purpose is for. So who exactly by the federal laws is an employee? Any individual employed by an employer. Okay, that sounds silly. You do an interview process, you do a job description, you post, you give them an employment contract, you give a hire date, you give them all the paperwork for a new hire. They have to have unemployment benefits, Medicaid, there's a lot of taxes, FICA that you're taking away from their paycheck. There's a lot of extra laws they're protected by that an independent contractor is not protected by. So they're protected by the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, Employment Retirement Income Security Act. That is the retirement funds that we hope when we're older we all get to actually tap into, our lovely Social Security. National Labor Relations Act. So anybody that's an employee, they can put a labor dispute against you, unfair labor practices. They have a lot more federal protection. They're hired by you for a specific purpose, part-time, full-time, hourly, salary rate. You have a job description. You're taking care of their day-to-day operations, discipline, evaluation. They get staff benefits just like everybody else that's full-time, part-time that you are offering to. You pay part of the taxes, they pay part of the taxes. Typically in a midwifery practice, this can be the midwives. I've seen it in situations where the midwives are independent contractors. The office manager, definitely, receptionist, medical assistant, nurses, people that are going to be their full-time day-to-day operations of the office, clinic, practice. It's a lot harder to have them rationalize as an independent contractor. So who exactly are your independent contractors? They are people that typically perform a specified task for a limited amount of time. There are situations where there's collaborating physicians, collaborating medical directors, and family nurse practitioners, NPs, PAs, midwives, that you do an independent contract on a longer basis, but they're running their mini practice within your practice. You guys are more umbrellaing each other's services. They typically have a business entity that they're going to collaborate with you versus their own personal entity. They're typically going to be filling in a need. You're short-staffed, you have somebody on maternity leave, you want to go on vacation, they're covering and filling a purpose. The scope of work, the independent contract is very specific. You're not supervising them. You're assuming they're experienced, they're the best of the best, they're qualified, they're competent, they're keeping up their license, they're many times maintaining their certifications and their malpractice. They're taking care of their own taxes. They're a mini business with this independent contract. So you can determine, I need help 40 hours a week. I need help 20 hours a week. I need help for 12 weeks. This is what I specifically need services helping in. And then they negotiate a contract with you that they determine, yes, it meets my terms of my services, or I have to renegotiate this. They have a lot more power within that relationship with you. They have to pay their own taxes, and this is a big deal because this is where businesses can get in trouble. If you hire an independent contractor and that person particularly didn't know they had to pay their own taxes, and it comes time for taxes and they haven't been collecting it, they're used to being W-2, they're used to it automatically coming out of their paychecks, and they weren't quarterly submitting taxes and they don't have the funds to the side, and you were treating them like an employee. You told them when to be there, you were hiring them, you were treating them like the rest of your staff. They can easily go to you as an independent contractor, go to state boards and say, you know, I was hired by her. I wasn't hired as an independent contractor. I was hired as an employer because of how they were treating me based on the regulations. And I've seen many businesses, they get stuck paying the difference of those taxes from the last year or multiple years. I've seen it where tax audits come up and then they realize, oh goodness, I didn't pay this, I didn't pay that because I didn't realize as an independent contractor I was supposed to. They're going to try to go to the business to get that done. And if you cannot defend and show how you were treating them like an independent contractor, that's where you get vulnerable. So the pros and cons of independent contractors. I love independent contractors. I just stress to midwives, you have to treat them like independent contractors. They're great for hiring for short term, higher skills, very unique situations. Like I've done it with lactation consultants, I've done it with doulas, childbirth educators. Very stressing. They're running their own mini business within my business. I'm not the one determining how they're going to practice, how long they're going to see people, what their flow of their practice style is going to be. The cons to it are you don't have direct control. Maybe you don't like their style. Maybe you don't like, obviously if there's a safety issue or a regulation or a HIPAA or some sort of violation happening, but if it's just a style thing, you have to respect that and just know it's short term and they're filling a need with you. Versus your staff, you can have an evaluation, you can have a team training, you can have a meeting, you can really follow up because they're your team, your staff long term. Contractors, there's more flexibility for the contractor on their hours. I want to work on Saturdays. I don't want to work on Saturdays. I want to be on birth call. I don't want to be on birth call. Locum assignments for midwives, you get to test the other side of it where you're negotiating with the traveling agency. You're being hired for a hospital. Another midwifery practice needs a need. You have a lot more negotiating power on the other end as the independent contractor than if you're in an interview process for a new job. You're filling filling in a need short term, you're adaptable, you have the skills, you're not involved in the day-to-day trainings, staff meetings, the mission of the company. Some people like that, some people don't. The cons of being the contractor side, it puts a little more financial burden on you. You aren't getting from that employment, which a lot of midwives, particularly certified nurse midwives, are used to getting: the benefits, the retirement, a good chunk of their taxes being paid by their W-2 before they get their paycheck, particularly self-employment tax. That doesn't exist if you are a W-2 staff on someone else's business. So you're not covered by the labor protection laws. They can hire and they can fire you at will. There is nothing you can go to say you've been discriminated against, you were wrongfully terminated, you as an independent contractor, and that sometimes is an advantage to the business that's hiring them. If all of a sudden they're a temp worker and they don't need them anymore, they can get rid of them very easily, don't have to tell rhyme and reasons why. So on the employee side, so you're deciding if you want to hire long-term permanent staff, or if you're thinking about, as a midwife, working somewhere as an employee, these are the things to think about. So as the business side, the benefits to having employees: they're easier to recruit and train. Most people are used to being employees for a company. They get a little more nervous when you talk about the options of an independent contract relationship. A lot of people just aren't as familiar with it. There's more of a chain of command for disciplinary protocols. You got to be more careful of how you are treating them, taking care of them, you're training them, your policies. You just have more laws. The employee is protected from you. Generally, it's more expensive to hire employees than it is to hire independent contractors, especially if you have a short need. The interview process, the recruiting, all the compliance regulatory things that you have to keep up with, and the additional taxes, it's sometimes a little easier to pay a little bit more to an independent contractor than what you would an employee, because you're still saving a bunch in all the other overhead admin expenses and taxes that you would have normally been paying, or benefits you'd have been responsible for. So there are situations, especially being a small business, that hiring independent contractors has a lot less overhead to maintain on a human resource perspective. Some of the benefits for the actual employee, the person that you're thinking about hiring: they get benefits from you, they get retirement, they get medical if you're offering that, they get not living paycheck to paychecks per se, because they have to go through steps. You can't just blindside them and say you're going to fire them without just cause, safety issues. They could go back and have repercussions against you. So there is a little bit more financial protection of a long-term relationship with a company, and many people feel comfort in that. The cons with being an employee is their earnings are subject to withholdings. They can't deduct business expenses like an independent contractor can. W-2 employees have very limited tax deductions. It's pretty much our standard tax deductions that everybody else gets. If you're a business owner or an independent contractor, you can tap into writing off so many expenses as work related with your pre-taxed earned income, which is massive. You're thinking you're in that 30 to 40% tax bracket. If you have to pay for your license, your upkeep, your vehicle, your clothes with your own paycheck, it's more expensive than if you were able to do it with the business, writing off any trainings, any travel with your mileage, your vehicle. There's a lot of benefits that an employee just can't tap into. So the hiring process is a bit different. I know we've talked about it briefly. You're going to put a job posting up for an employee on ZipRecruiter, Indeed. Independent contractors can be hired that way, but that's typically not how they do it. It tends to be more word of mouth. It tends to be outsourcing. If you're looking for an independent contractor, you're going to reach out to a locum agency. You're going to reach out to a group of midwives and say, hey, I'm looking for some help in this short term, this specific need. You're going to reach out to companies that do this for a living, a marketing company, a website design, an already established lactation consulting service that's going to help fill in some breastfeeding support while you're doing a trial if you want to make it a long-term permanent full-time position. Like, There's a lot of hiring steps that are a lot easier being an independent contractor because it's specific, it's to the point. They already typically, as a business or an independent contractor, will have statements of work, will have the legal paperwork. The agreements are easy to complete and you can get them started right away. As far as employees, you got to put a job posting up, you got to wait for applicants, you got to do an interviewing process, you got to negotiate contracts with the final potentials that you want to hire. You got to get the new hiring paperwork, especially with a midwife or a staff that needs a license in the state and credentialed with your insurance. It takes 2 to 3 months to do that. Independent contractors still need to be contracted with your insurance, but it's a lot easier. They're being added on to your already group contract, and they typically already have a state license and a DEA and an NPI and all those things, so it does save a little bit of time on that regards. When you're an employee, you've got an orientation, a much more training. Independent contractors for locums get 1 day, maybe 2 of that 12, 14-week support timeline. They just jump right in, and that's what they're expected to do to fill a need quickly. Employees are more given comfort and mission and the long-term goals of the practice because their intent is to be there long-term. So tax documentation is definitely different between the two. For an employee, you have to provide them your name, address, social security, tax filing status, W-2 forms, W-2, and there's responsibilities for the business in both directions and the new hiring process. With independent contractors, you also have to provide your name, address, tax ID number, typically instead of a social security number. It just depends on if you're independent contracting with an individual or with a business. So if you're independent contracting with an individual, it'll be a social security number, but most independent contractors have their own LLC, have an S Corp. They're representing themselves as a business to the public. A W-9 form is completed if anytime you're starting that relationship, so you can verify all the information is correct. You want to there's a lot less initial paperwork, and then at the end of the year, instead of a W-2, you're going to do a 1099 if you had paid that contractor more than $600 in a calendar year. So the initial paperwork is less, and it's just different type of forms you have to do for an independent contractor. Financial cost comparison: an employee, their hourly, their salary, the fixated work time, job description, you have longer responsibility with them, tax overhead, administration cost, benefits, training, upkeep. Independent contractors, they can be paid hourly, commission, or a lump sum. But the big difference is they're starting right away with the contracted scope of work that they've agreed to. There's typically not much of a training process, maybe 1 day of orientation, shadowing you and jumping in and filling a need. They have no long-term investment in the company. They're really a backup option collaboration. They're a fill-in here and there. They're just temp work for a specific task within your company. You're not responsible for their taxes, they are. So typically a contractor is going to ask for a little more pay than an employee, but it just depends on what your needs are. So the payment for services, you can do an employee, typically it's every 2 weeks is the standard. You can pay them directly out of like a QuickBooks or just some sort of payroll system that you get. You're taking out their state and federal taxes for them prior to distribution, and then any of the taxes the business directly has to pay: Medicaid, FICA, Social Security, all those other ones. As an independent contractor, they typically send you an invoice, and it can vary greatly. It could be weekly, it could be a direct deposit immediately upon invoice, every 2 weeks, monthly, or just maybe you have to do a deposit at the beginning and you have to pay the rest once the work is completed. Or maybe you have to pay all up front. Maybe you're doing a website design and they need all of it. So everybody is completely different, and that's a negotiation between you and the independent contractor. The big difference is the independent contractor pays all their taxes. You are not responsible for any of their taxes whatsoever. So some of the things to think about, these are all the different independent contractors tend to be entrepreneurial spirit. There is a great win-win opportunity for an independent relationship, and I don't want midwives to steer away from it because of the fears of regulations. Write a good, strong contract, don't treat them like an employee, and have very clear expectations of their job role and your role in that relationship. So we've already reviewed the pits and perks of being an independent contractor. It's a great option, especially in the last couple years as people are realizing that job security isn't as great as they thought. Maybe as a worker, it's just a nice way to fill in here and there for a job you like, travel the country, but also as a business owner, you can find great independent talent that's just fast, quick, fills in a need temporarily because things are ever changing right now. You don't know if you're gonna, maybe you need a full-time hired midwife, but you don't have the funds quite yet to hire them. Maybe you can get an independent contractor to help you out part-time until you get enough volume or budget to really get that extra help. So it can be those great bridges for adding additional providers. It can be a great bridge between vacations and time off, backup call coverage, maternity leave, long-term medical. I mean, the list can go on and on for staff call coverage, but just filling in tasks and roles short-term for your business. The marketing side, most of the time they're independent contractors. Some billers are independent contractors and some are employees. So there's a lot of things to think about with what do you want to do with your business? Where do you want to go short-term, long-term? And what type of staff to add onto your team makes the most sense at this point in time? So conclusion, just wanting to stress, they're both great options, and a lot of midwifery practices intermix both, but just being very clear, if you hire birth assistants, most of them tend to be independent contractors. If they're a medical assistant working full-time in your team, but then they're also doing birth assistant call, they tend to be an employee. If you have a midwife that you're hiring from day one, telling them what days they have to be there, you're giving a full orientation process, you're really managing their day-to-day operations of when they have to be there, when they have to work, what their role looks like, they're an employee. If you need backup call coverage, you need help here and there, you want to hire a midwife and you guys work kind of like two mini businesses and benefit from each other, it's going to be a completely independent, different relationship. So it's important for midwives and business owners to understand the difference between independent contractors and employees as far as the startup legal paperwork, the worker rights, the way you pay them, the tax structure, the invoice versus paychecks. There's just a lot to think about. The last thing you want to do as a business owner is accidentally misclassify an employee as an independent contractor because it can have massive repercussions long term of back taxes that you owe as the business versus the thought to be independent contractor that you treated like an employee.